Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming along tonight for our Meet the Leaders with Bishop Paul Butler. This evening's event was supposed to be hosted by George Freeman, who unfortunately got stuck in the chamber of the House of Commons, and so so you got me instead. I'm Dermot Campbell. I'm the managing director of the Big Tent, and it's a pleasure to have you all along. The question we're talking about tonight is how we can break the cycle of deprivation to improve the life chances of the most vulnerable children and families in the UK. And I think if we want to break the cycle of poverty, that has to be one of the most important questions that is asked. Do you please, the idea of this is it's supposed to be very much an active engagement. So it's neither me nor Paul talking at you. It's intended to be a discussion. Paul will say a little bit at the beginning. Please do post questions in the chat as we go. We're not in an enormous number tonight, so it's relatively easy to get it to involve people. It would be great if you could put your cameras on, because it makes it just nicer and easier for people to engage. So I would encourage that, if you will. And if you could keep yourselves on mute, you'll be muted anyway. If you could keep yourselves on mute unless you actually want to talk. And if you want to speak, then please do just pop a question into the chat, and I will pick it up and bring you in. So you didn't come along to hear me talk all night. You came along to have a discussion with Paul. So without further ado, over to you, Paul.
Thank you, and thank you everyone who's joined this evening. And I look forward to the conversation, because I certainly don't think I have all the answers to how we break the cycle of deprivation. But I hope that some of what I share gives us a framework for a discussion. What I want to begin with saying is that I think that if we are to ever break the cycle of deprivation, because we all know that this is not a new issue, it's been going on a very long time, that if we are to break it, we need a bigger vision for children than we currently have as a nation. We need a bigger vision for every child. I'll come back to the phrase that we use in the Church of England in our education team, life in all its fullness, which of course is actually a quote from Jesus that you find in John's Gospel. I came to give life in all its fullness. And I think actually that's a phrase that, Christian or not, people can latch onto as a vision for children, life in all its fullness. We currently, I would argue, operate on a too limited vision for children. It tends to be too limited because it tends to be too much about economic contribution, which itself tends to be too narrowly defined anyway as who are economic contributors. I'll cite you a very personal example. My wife has not had paid employment for a very long time. However, suggests that she is not contributing to the life of the nation or the well-being of a community, and I'll start citing you everything that she does and has done over very many years. And of course, she is a living example of many who contribute in all kinds of ways, but don't get counted or included as those who are economically contributing. And the trouble is that impinges on our vision for children, because we see them as non-contributors for a long while. I would argue that children are not adults in the making, but they are fully human now, and they are contributing to the life of the nation, whatever age they are. When I was a vicar in East London, in Walthamstow, one of the things that we tried to do every time we had many young families, every time a new baby was brought into the life of the church, the first time that they appeared at any event, we tried to say something along the lines of, we as a whole church community have been changed by the birth and addition of this new member of our community, because this baby now brings something to all of us and changes all of us and all of our lives. Some more obviously impactful than others, the immediate family. But we are, as a whole community, different. And we welcome this child as someone who has already started contributing by simply being present and by making us behave differently and thinking differently. So we need a bigger vision for children. In particular, we need a much bigger vision around the early years. There has, of course, been an increasing recognition of the significance of early years of childhood. Now, the Jesuits are famous for having a quote about for giving me a child until he or she is 7, and I will show you the man or the woman. To be honest, of course, the original quote was, give me a child till he is 7, and I will show you the man. I've updated it fractionally. Now, of course, we know that, but saying 7 is rather overstating. It's the first 1,001 days of life, which are the most significant for the health, the well-being, and actually the future prospects of every child. So we need a much stronger emphasis on early years. Now, this has been said and reiterated time and time again over the last decades, and has most recently been done so by Andrea Leadsom with her most recent report on early years, which contains a lot of very good thoughts and ideas and practical suggestions. And I hope the words of support that have been stated in government circles turn into serious action and policy. This must include, though, helping parents prepare to be parents. So support through pregnancy, not just for the mother carrying the child, but for the father as well, or the other mother, or the other father, depending on the circumstances that families are now coming into being. Supporting parents through that whole process so that they are better prepared when the child arrives. And that would go for families where they're fostering or adopting as well. So the role of midwives, the role of health visitors, and others alongside them is critical. And these, of course, have been cut back in various ways, health visitors in particular. So practically, I would be arguing for a restoration of the numbers of health visitors and that whole support. And then when young children come into the world, when babies come into the world, we need to give space and capacity to support families in whatever shape they are through family hubs as well as direct support. Because one of the best ways of supporting a family is contact with other families who are going through the same processes and mutual learning from one another. Quite a number of years ago now, I worked for an organisation called Scripture Union, and I worked with churches all over East London, particularly churches in the poorer areas. And we started piloting parenting courses for families with children of all kinds of ages. And we always did evaluations. You won't be surprised to hear that the top thing every time we ran one about what people had most valued was nothing at all that we had contributed. It was meeting other people going through the same situations and sharing and comparing notes. But they all then said, so the best thing that you've done as the leaders is make it happen and give us space in which to do it. And that's the best thing about family hubs. creating that space and offering support for families, particularly through those earliest 2 to 2.5 years, is what matters most. And that's where keeping in touch with those families, offering them advice and guidance all the way through. For we know that the greatest need for every child is that they are loved, that they feel loved, that they know they are loved and cared for. One of my favorite books is by a man who has become a good friend over the years, Keith White, who's both a sociologist and a theologian, and it's a book called The Growth of Love. In this, Keith uses the simple mechanism of having 5 fingers. What causes love to grow? Security, boundaries, significance, community, and creativity. And we need to keep encouraging people to think about actually what policies help love grow. Some thoughts then on education and work and housing specifically, as well as the early years. Education is meant to be about leading out. That's the root of the word, to lead out. Unfortunately, for most of us and most people still in education through schooling, it tends to still have an emphasis on pouring in rather than leading out. What information, what knowledge do we think we have to pour into our children and young people, rather than how do we help draw out from them who the best people they can be? Because the best education is always about leading and drawing out. It encourages exploration. It encourages discovery and creativity. For me, the primary purpose of education is to help everyone be the best human being that they can be, to be the best person, to discover who they are as the best human being that they can be, as part of the community. Not simply who am I as an individual, but who am I as part and parcel of the society and the community of which I'm a part. This means that actually the whole raft of creativity in education is incredibly important. So music, drama, dance, making things. I was brought up in the days when we still had things called direct grant grammar schools, and I went to one. And I was basically educated that it would be demeaning for me to learn to make things with my hands. So we didn't do woodwork or metalwork or anything like that, because that was for those who were not as clever as we were. That's hampered me for the rest of my life. My wife and I were talking about this over, because I was sharing with her 1 or 2 things I might say. And she said, yes, of course. But she went to a school where it was still the case that they did do things with their hands. But if you were a girl, you had to do domestic science and needlework, and you weren't allowed to do metalwork or woodwork. And likewise, the boys couldn't do the other way around. Thankfully, we're not quite in that anymore. But my point is that actually everybody needs creativity and being able to explore creative ways of discovering who we are and engaging with other people. We increasingly know the power that music has on our brains and so on. Yes, of course, education must include the basic skills of language and so forth. But my experience certainly is that where people know why they've got a good reason to learn to read and write, they are much more likely to enter and engage in it rather than simply having to learn it by rote. So education needs quite a radical rethink, I think. Then the world of work. Work needs to be structured so that those with the care of children have adequate time and income to fulfill their caring roles. Hence why, one of the reasons why I'm a great supporter of the living wage and now the living hours movement as well, is because it enables people to actually have time for their families. One of the greatest testimonies around that you hear when companies go for the living wage, and when you hear families then talk about it, what difference has this made to us? One of the constant themes that comes out from the children in those families is we see our parents more, we do things with mum and dad more, we have time with them more because they're not having to work all the hours that God sends them. It's why I also believe that the child benefit ought to be re-evaluated back to where it was when it was first created, so that it enables families to have the adequate time to raise their children well on behalf of the whole of society. And it's why welfare support needs to be at adequate levels, so that when things go wrong for people, as you can never quite know when they will, that's at levels that allow for good childcare and good child support to happen. Raising children is a very, very high calling. I'm quite often asked, Bishop, what do you think is your greatest achievement? I happen to have 4 adult children. I have no doubt that the greatest achievement is raising 4 children. Nothing else bears any comparison in my mind with it. Which leads on to housing, where we need to rethink, we need to think our housing policies much more carefully through, so that children have good play space, they have good space in which to live, but also access to good space outside, safe space outside. That's my time up, so I'm going to stop at that. The core thing is to have a bigger vision that places children at the heart of policy thinking and making. Practically, I'm one of those who's arguing very strongly that we need to restore a minister for children at the heart of government in the cabinet. And I'm with the new Children's Commissioner on saying that every statement that comes from the Prime Minister's mouth and the Chancellor's mouth, if it does not include reference to the impact that this policy will have on children, then it's inadequate and needs to be rethought.
Paul, that was that was a wonderful introduction, and I think there were lots of great things which you pulled out. I see there's a couple of conversations going on in the chat. The question which I'm really interested to know is, when you've got a situation where somebody has been poorly parented, so a parent has been poorly parented, how can we possibly help them to parent well?
That's a good question. So I certainly want to avoid any sense of determinism, because someone's been poorly parented means that they will poorly parent. Although the risks of that happening are higher. So what support can we put in? How do we help people unlearn some of the poor parenting? Now, the reality, of course, is that all of us experience a mix of good parenting and poor parenting. There are things that I look back on about how I was parented and think, well, that could have been better, mum and dad. But you did. Yeah, I knew I was loved. That was the core. We had a fantastic conversation a few years ago when Rosemary and I had been asked to do something together on parenting. So we sat our 4 children, they were then late teens and early 20s, and said, come on, you tell us, what do you think we've done well and what do you think we've done badly? And we compared notes. And what was interesting was some of the things that they highlighted, we had completely forgotten. And some of the things that we thought we'd done really badly, they couldn't remember. So perspectives change. So I think, the whole thing of helping people who've been poorly parented, and I think it begins actually in school, Dermot. I think we need to look at doing some help and support in our schools on helping people, young people. So it's through relationships and sex education, for example. How help teenagers think. If you one day became a parent, and most would say they quite like that idea. Some don't, but most do. What do you think would be good about being a parent? So we need to do more parental education at an earlier age. That would be one place I'd start.
Interesting. And I see, Anna, I see you started a conversation in the chat about the venture. Do you want to talk for a second about that?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Apologies for blocking up the chat, but it's something I was very passionate about, and Paul really struck a note with me when he was talking about the importance of the first couple of years. Because obviously, I mean, you know, everyone knows the kind of importance of Sure Start and the work that was doing. But one of the very specific projects that we set up in about 2007 was a recognition that there were still a lot of parents who just weren't accessing Sure Start, weren't able to benefit from it. Often the most sort of vulnerable young mums, teenage mums, younger mums, people often left by themselves to deal with pregnancies and young children that they just were generally really struggling with, alongside a whole raft of other issues. So we set up the Family Nurse Partnership, which was an idea we sort of stole from America, which was about getting a health visitor to have really intense visits every fortnight with the young mum at their home until the child was 2. So kind of really they're seeing the surroundings and helping the mum do everything from giving up smoking to child-proofing the house, making sure the house was safe, helping them with kind of empathy and learning and parenting, all the kind of stuff that Paul was talking about. And the outcomes of that in terms of the impact on the mum's mental health, particularly, which we found was a big issue for vulnerable younger mums, for the outcomes for the child and their readiness for school, giving up smoking, you know, as a ability to manage finance. The outcomes on that were absolutely huge. I mean, it was a very expensive program because it was intensive, but I'd love to think that we could look again at trying to kind of replicate that more widely across the system. So I just wanted to kind of raise that. I also popped in a question as well, because I was very struck recently by the comments from the Education Secretary about what a disaster we've got now post-COVID. Children have lost all discipline and they're going back, essentially saying they're kind of going back to school feral. And I saw something from the Department for Education, which was a video of a school saying we have like huge discipline, we don't allow children to talk in corridors, we don't allow children to forget their books, be late. And I just kind of felt, God, for me, as you know, I did well academically at school, but I always forgot my books. I was probably a bit kind of disruptive. And thinking about everything you said there, Paul, about the importance of creativity, of love, of being a well-rounded kind of student. What are your feelings about the kind of coming out of the pandemic and how much pressure we put on children to just deal with what they've just had to deal with over the last year, as well as the kind of pressures of the education system?
Goodness, there's a lot there. And
sorry.
No, that's fine. So I agree with. I mean, I think that intense input that was done with the most needy families. I think one of the tough things to do in the early years is there isn't a single parent with a young child who doesn't need some kind of support. So we need to support all families, but also then recognize which are the most needy and where's the more intensive support. And the last thing I want to do is see more children taken away from their natural parent and into care. We need to put support in to help children stay there. And yes, it's costly, but, and this is where I think we get the economics all wrong, the long-term cost of not putting that in is much higher than the cost of putting that support in early. And we need to think much longer term. And it's part of the problem of 5-year terms of politics is, of course, those longer term costs really only trigger in when they're teenagers or in their 20s and beyond that, when it's a completely different government and they're not concerned. So that's on that. The kids have been through an extraordinary thing over this last year, and you may, whether I'm privileged or not, I don't know, because I chair the National Society for the Church of England. That means I actually have at least a termly meeting with the Secretary of State for Education. So I get one-to-ones with him, and so we've talked privately about some of these things. I really, really wish that the thinking about the return to school and return to education, the first focus should have been, and could still be, how are we going to help children and young people recover from all that they've missed, which is largely friendships, relationships, play, the opportunity to be together, and so on. And the emphasis in the initial stages of return to school should have been entirely on social, mental, spiritual well-being, and then build the academic recovery for those who need that at a later stage. And we should have really a 10-year recovery plan for those children, not a 2 to 3 year recovery plan. The situation in different schools will vary enormously. So I'm quite sure that Gavin could offer us some examples of feral. I can offer you plenty of examples where it's the other way, as you say. And really, head teachers and teachers and the children themselves need to, by and large, to be just applauded and congratulated for coping with extraordinary things, and coping with not having guidance and then being given guidance that didn't work, and so on and so forth.
Fascinating, and I'm going to come back to some of what Anna was saying in a few minutes. But Jen Person, you put some interesting points in the chat. Do you want to voice those?
Sure, thank you. Sorry, I wasn't set up to be on screen. So obviously the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child offers us some of the mechanisms we might be able to use in policy making, but obviously government has just pushed back on some in part of what Scotland has just adopted in putting the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child actually into Scottish legislation. How do you think we might encourage policymakers in a non-partisan way to take that approach and see the pros of adopting some concrete mechanisms for putting children's rights, making children's rights more visible and actually effective, and have mechanisms that we can adopt them as part of legislation and policy making?
So Jen, thank you. Ideally, I agree. I wish we actually adopted the rights of the child, and I think Scotland has given us an example, because that then sets a framework in which every party has to operate. I suppose governments have tried it with the family test, which has never really worked, partly because they never published the results of the inquiry. So I think if you adopt the rights of the child, you then actually have to find ways of making sure that impact assessments and so forth are very transparent. So I would somehow find a way of ensuring greater transparency in reporting back on all sorts of things. It wouldn't just apply to children and children's affairs. It would apply to all sorts of other bits. But for the purposes of this evening, yeah. But Scotland have offered us some interesting models, actually.
Interesting. Wendy, Wendy Main, you were asking about the parish system. Do you want to ask your question? And by the way, if people want to if people want me to ask a question, then do say so in the chat.
Yeah, I'm interested in knowing how you would suggest parishes go about helping in this situation. I happen to live, or my husband and I happen to live in a parish where there are very few children because of an historical issue whereby a new, more modern church opened 3 miles up the road, and there was this sort of exit. However, we have a church school, and we started off doing Open the Book, but then the two of us who were doing it got older and other issues came up, And so that stopped. But we would like to go in and do, for example, an assembly once a month. But what can we do that would help to move forward things for children and for their parents? Because I'm very concerned that very often parenting is what we remember of our own parenting. And where it's been poor, which very often it has been for people whose children fail, then they need help to understand what they can do and how they can go about changing things. Thank you.
Oh, well, there are a range of things. We did some research just a few years ago around toddler groups. The extraordinary thing about toddler groups in this country is that this is in England. Something close to 90% of toddler groups in England happen on church premises. They're not church run, a large number of them, but they happen in church halls and church buildings and so on. So one of the things that churches can do is make their premises available for space for children, whether it's carers and toddlers or whether it's older ones. National Children's Bureau recently did a survey during lockdown of their youth council and did a survey on what were the highest wants of children and young people at present. And one of the top four was, we just want places and spaces where it's safe for us to gather together and have fun together. In other words, there's a cry for youth clubs or children's clubs and so on. So one of the things that I think parishes can do is just make their space available, even if it's run by other people, and uniformed organisations is one of the obvious partners. We are here up in Durham. One of the things we're exploring as schools come back and as churches' premises become more available is to ask questions around how can local church congregations, regardless of their age and regardless of whether they have any children present or not, how can we work with schools on caring for our environment locally? So we know that children and young people are very passionate about climate change, about environment, and about that, but often we'll see it as far too big an issue for them. So, but what about our local environment? How do we green up our local environment? And churches often have churchyards that could be quite a key player in that. Naturally, but that's one of them.
May I just add that one of our huge difficulties is that the church is quite large and freezing.
Ah, yes.
And we have no extra room. So
right, okay, yeah.
That's a common problem across lots of churches, I think, isn't it, Paul?
It is, and of course the Church of England has made a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2030, and actually, I don't think every church building will be, but we're saying as a community, how do you make ourselves totally in toto carbon neutral, which means we've got to make quite a lot of our homes and other buildings better than carbon neutral, so that the church building itself can then be patched in.
Yes, yeah. It's so there are a couple of interesting things which are coming up. Coming back to Anna's point and sort of picking up a little bit on Wendy's point around my what I raised about the sort of poor parents becoming parents. An interesting experience that I had with my 4 children. When my youngest was born, the midwife, who was quite an earthy character, a great lady. And my wife was quite a senior midwife in Queen Charlotte's Hospital. And when Arabella was born, the midwife picked Arabella up, but she was born by cesarean, and she came out, and the midwife stuffed her up my gown. And so the first person Arabella ever touched was me. And of all the children, she's just clung onto my leg ever since. And I would say, of all the relationships we've had, and I joke about that, but of all the relationships I've had with my 4 children, by far the strongest one has been with Arabella, because and I think my wife pioneered, or was part of a team which pioneered something called the one-to-one midwifery group back in the very late 80s, early 90s. And the one-to-one midwifery group was originally probably mostly available to middle-class West Londoners, but subsequently has been moved to people with real social needs. But it was a really, truly brilliant thing. And coming back to one of the thing which Anna was talking about her, about the process, the program they were working on, it was a really, truly brilliant thing, where you had that absolute continuity, and it were able the midwife to give real help to the mother, and actually involve the father in that midwifery process. And the lady who stuffed Arabella up my gown was part of that program. I've completely forgotten her name now, and I shouldn't have done. Jenny. So I thought that was a really interesting thing.
No, absolutely, and the biggest problem about enabling that kind of thing to happen at the moment is that the number of midwives per birth has reduced, and but even more so, health visitor numbers have been massively reduced. And so that's got to be reversed. Anne Longfield, the outgoing Children's Commissioner, in one of her last reports, that was one of the things that she highlighted, was the need to change approach to health visitors.
Yeah, and I think my ex actually believed that the one-to-one system was more efficient, but it put more demands on it did put more demands on the midwives, but it was more efficient, she believed. But
well, it's exactly the same. If you go to other, children who do get taken into care or are at risk and are in touch with social workers and so on, it's very clear that where there's one social worker who works with the family and the child consistently for a long period of time, they are always much more successful than where the family and the child get bounced from one social worker to another, and they never know which one's going to turn up next. And social workers, childcare social workers, have about double the load that is actually practical to work sensibly in depth with the families.
I do incredibly strongly believe that if we want to fix society, we have to fix parenting first.
Yeah.
And until we fix parenting, we won't fix society. So rather than me harping on, there's more going on in the chat. Mark Essex, you brought up a point. Did you want to come in and voice that?
Yes, I mean, thank you. I agree with loads of what's been said. I suppose, I mean, for example, there's a question about should we extend the school day, which might be the question that comes next. And I just wonder, is the state the best way to get this done? I'm quite intrigued by other organisations such as the church taking off. I mean, thinking in a very simplistic way, if we get the state to do it, we've all got to work more hours to pay the teachers to work more hours to teach our kids, which takes our parents away even more from their kids because they've got to earn more money to pay the taxes. And I just think, what you talked about woodworking and creative skills. There are loads of skills and experiences which lay people have to offer, which don't require qualified teachers, afraid I hate. And I just wonder, have we created an expectation where I pay my taxes is seen as a sufficient contribution to society, end of responsibility? It didn't used to be. We used to go to work and then be involved in all sorts of community and civic, have responsibilities to our community. And I just wonder, have we sort of foregone that because it ought to be done by professionals and we pay our taxes and it's somebody else's problem? So a bit of a question about, was the big society such a bad idea? Because it seemed to me to be the right idea, perhaps ahead of its time. But what do you think?
Mark,
I wonder, before you answer that, Paul, since that was very much connected to Natalie's question. Natalie, did you want to add anything to that?
No, hi everyone. No, I think the question I had kind of speaks for itself. Is just, I think it feels to me anyway, and I should, confess I work for UNICEF, so I was, really pleased to see Jen's question about the CRC and impact assessments. And I hate to use the word opportunity around COVID because that feels wrong, but it feels like with the impacts of the pandemic and, the country now moving out of lockdown and sort of looking towards that future and that recovery, it does feel like there is a real moment here to, kind of rethink, reimagine some of those, core systems that underpin our society. So, education, social security, the health system, tax increases, whatever that might be. And there's been quite a lot of ideas and suggestions floating around about amending the school day or shortening, lengthening the terms to, incorporate more of that holistic and, well-being approach to education as well. And I'd just be sort of really keen to get your opinion, Paul, on, how you see that working. Is that something that you think would benefit every child, or, is that something that would, potentially only benefit those children who are able to stay and able to receive those, additional, mechanisms of support or, services that were available? Yeah.
So if I pick both of those up, I agree with you, Mark. I think if we just think this is about paying more people to do more work, then no, it does actually need to be more. Across Africa, they use the phrase about it takes a village to raise a child, and that's absolutely there's total truth in it. It's a whole community thing, and I think one of the dangers of over individualization, which is one of the things I think we've gone through or are in the midst of, is that we've started asking parents to do more than they can handle without support of a wider community and a wider family. We've also started asking schools to deliver more than schools were ever designed to or set up to do, and certainly without giving them adequate support and so forth. So that comes to that. If we extend the school day in order to create the space to do more sport, creativity, and so forth, that needs to be done in a way which is accessible to all. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's provided by the teachers and the teaching staff. That's where actually churches, mosques, synagogues, wider society comes in and volunteers. We then get fascinating challenges about a safeguarding culture. Now, I used to be the lead bishop for safeguarding, so I take safeguarding extremely seriously, and I don't want to undermine it in any way. But I do think there's a danger that we've got so risk averse that we're making it almost impossible for people to volunteer into those settings to provide that kind of support and openness and so forth. Part and parcel of the answer is you just make sure you've got adequate numbers of adults there to ensure that no one adult is ever alone with a child, and then I think there's a whole resource that we should explore more, which is teenagers themselves. I think there's a lot of folk in secondary schools who would actually love to go back into their primary schools and help those children play and learn and discover and so forth, because they're that bit better at football, they're that bit better at X, Y, or Z, and so there's I think we need to get more young volunteers in as well. So that's some of the stuff. And yes, Natalie, there is an opportunity here. My fear is the thrust is we want to race back to where we were before, rather than stop and reflect on what lessons have we learned that we really want to carry forward and what changes might be needed in order to make that happen. And thank you for the work you're doing, Natalie. In fact, I've just agreed today to sign a letter that Natalie's put together that's going to the Prime Minister on some of these.
Thank you.
Excellent. I mean, there are lots more questions coming in the chat. I see Hannah Davis. I see you've got a question there. I know Susie, I'm going to come back to you in a second. And I know Paul Goldsmith. Hannah, did you want to come in with your question first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dermot. So, I mean, there's a lot of chat about society and about how people need to get more involved, but I think it ignores the fact that there are a lot of dysfunctional societies. So, for example, over half the north has worse health outcomes than the worst area in the southeast of England. You're talking of areas where there's intergenerational unemployment and a lot of these difficulties. And I think, you know, working parents who are in poverty already, whose wages, even though they may work full time, don't support their family. And so although nice it is the idea that we can just get societies to bunch together, it's only that you need whole scale transformation. Getting local businesses to help is going to be at the very most basic sticking plaster point of view. We need this is why levelling up as a concept is really important, and this is why it's important that it's delivered properly and it's delivered in the left behind areas which don't have the access to great local companies, which don't have really supportive kind of communities around them who have the capacity and the know-how to provide the supports that people actually need when raising children and creating these community assets. So I'd be interested to get Paul's opinion on that.
So Hannah, yeah, I mean, so I live in the area of the country that has the highest level of child poverty. So it's something we live with in the northeast very, very regularly. There are, so that's why. So I mentioned. I mean, I'm a great supporter of the living wage, not the national minimum wage, but actually the living wage as the Living Wage Foundation. So part of the levelling it up for me would be about that. On businesses, one of the things that's come up in the pandemic here in the northeast, where we have a large number of small and medium-sized businesses, the Chamber of Commerce is saying to us, more broadly, we want to do things differently. We think we can do things differently. We think as small and medium-sized businesses, we can contribute differently. We want to move away from a purely financial bottom line. We actually think this is the Chamber of Commerce actually having this conversation about how are we being socially responsible? How are we engaging with environmental concerns? And we want to come out of this thinking differently. And I think there's more hope, bluntly, working with small and medium businesses than with the really big businesses at a local community level in terms of that. But yet you're right, there has to be overall a much wider levelling up. The other, though, is I sometimes find myself asking the question, who has the better family life? My mother is in Dorset. I have two sisters in Dorset. I have 4 grown-up children. They all happen to live very close together in East London, but that's a long way from where I am. I have a grandson who I haven't seen. I'm very, very excited because I'm going to see him for the first time in 7 months on Thursday this week. He's 2, so I've missed the last quarter of his life in any face-to-face contact. And that's my family. We're scattered. We do all sorts of things together. We still have big, every 2 years, my side of the family, we get together. We have 35 of us staying together and celebrating Christmas together, and that makes us weird. We actually get on with each other. We like it. But on the big estates on the edge of Sunderland or the edge of Hartlepool, Mam has been there every day during the pandemic. Grandma's been there every day. Those families, they might have spread COVID to one another a bit more than we would have liked, but they've supported one another, they've helped one another. There's a kind of asset there about mutual support, mutual society. And when they've run out of food, when they've shared a loaf of bread because there's assets in some of the poorest communities that they want themselves, I think, to be encouraged and brought out more. So we need to do both. It is a levelling up, but the levelling up includes recognising the wealth in some of the poorest communities that they offer themselves and can offer to others of us about well-being.
I think that's
but you're right, Hannah. In-work poverty is actually a bigger issue than out-of-work poverty.
Yeah, I'd just like to quickly give my apologies. I've got to go and take my son to Scouts in Durham. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, Hannah. It's all a fascinating topics. And Susie, I haven't forgotten about you. You really interestingly raised the issue of mental health in your question. Did you want to come in and speak about that?
Sure, thanks, Dermot. Good evening, everybody. So my experience was born of being the chair of governors of two Church of England primary schools, one in Bethnal Green and one near the Tower of London, both in very deprived areas. Neither, not high levels of Christian pupils, very high levels of Muslim pupils, non-English speaking, a lot of children coming to school with those difficulties, but an awful lot of children in those areas having other difficulties as well. And the school found it really, both schools have always found it very difficult to access support from the state services. So we ended up buying in support from Place to Be. I don't know how many people know Place to Be. I personally think they're a fantastic organisation, but that was several £1,000s a year for each school, which meant that we couldn't then spend that money on other things. And we didn't have any, there's no way we were ever going to be raising money from the parent group or anything like that. That wasn't an option. So we did what we needed to do. We bought in support, but it's always struck me that was shocking, frankly, having to use some of the school's budget for that. We should have been able to access a proper service, or Place to Be should have been funded centrally. And just going back to something earlier you said, Paul, about if those children aren't helped early on, all that happens is the problems get worse, and then that'll cost society far more in the long term than if we nip it in the bud. So I would love to see some central addressing of that injustice.
I agree. One of my I'll do an advert if I may, because my son's wife runs an extremely good community cafe in Bethnal Green. It's called the Beehive.
Yeah. I think mental health services are a massive challenge, aren't they?
They are. They are, and again, they've been underfunded and under-recognised. I think before the pandemic, sitting in the House of Lords, having some debate. So before the pandemic, there was a growing awareness of the imbalance of expenditure on mental health compared with other aspects of health. Needed to be addressed. I think what the pandemic has highlighted that imbalance is even more than we thought, and needs to be addressed. And child mental health and young person's mental health, and indeed parental mental health. If we go back to the parenting thing, one of the things that has emerged in recent years is the amount of so we know about postnatal depression for mothers. Actually, there's growing evidence that there's also postnatal depression for quite a number of fathers. not nearly as significant as it is from others, but just recognizing that that's also an issue that needs to be addressed.
There are so many things around those dynamics of parenthood.
Yeah.
As a father, you can end up feeling very isolated, very alone, and your partner can feel very very left out as well. And there's so much help, which, coming back to Anna's point, can be delivered by really great people like my ex Maggie, who did it through maternity and through the health services, and where that all of that fails through good, decent social work services. But unfortunately, we don't have any of those four.
No. But so one of the other things about wider society, an awful lot of mental health stuff can be nipped in the bud earlier by simply good support and places where people can chat. And so it's one of the things that I think a lot more churches could actually offer. Very simple. You'd never call it talking therapies. That's actually what you're doing, though. You're just giving people a space to say, actually, I feel left out.
Yeah.
And to be able to talk about that stops it becoming a major problem longer term.
It does, and I wonder if I might bring Paul Goldsmith in at this moment, given your background, Paul, and the fact that you have been waiting for a while to ask a question.
Well, first of all, thank you. It's been a fantastic discussion, and I've learned so much. And I'm slightly embarrassed because I have been involved through strategic clinical networks in some attempts at early years and life course management, and yet there are insights tonight which I was unaware of. I mean, one of the traps that we're in the NHS is that all of the focus is on putting the plasters on. I mean, even with IAPT, which is very successful, Richard Layard's program to get cognitive behavioral therapy as the mainstay for anxiety and depression for adults. And it's now got over 1 million people who run through that program every year. But it's still, it costs a lot to deliver. It's quite intensive. Trying to get upstream into prevention is very, very difficult because you don't see the returns for a number of years. Similarly, on the physical health side, so much of that is mental health related. Yet we're in the trap of the NHS budget being heading for 150 billion, and more will go in because what is the main optic is on waiting times. It's not on the things which everyone is highlighting around parenting skills in those early years, which we know are the best returns of investment, but we can't get that link through. I don't know what the answer is. I'd be really interested in your thoughts, Mark's, in terms of the sort of the financial optic side.
I mean, it would be worth bringing Mark in on that.
Well, yeah, it's tricky. It probably. I mean, you can make a business case, right? People make business cases to Treasury all the time that say, there's money to be saved here with some investment, we can get a return. And money is cheap, really, really, really cheap. Even Argentina can borrow money for 100 years at 9%. Britain can borrow money at effectively negative interest rates. But it's not for want of money as much as how to spend it. And make sure you're getting good value for it, and the leadership that comes with that money. But yeah, clear. You can make the case that investing in early years or investing in wound care reduces subsequent liabilities for the NHS, or investing in Sure Start will make a long-term impact on the benefits bill. I guess the trouble is the Treasury sort of don't believe you, because people make those cases all the time, and somehow the money doesn't get saved; it just gets spent again. And people worry about double running costs. In the NHS, that's always the thing. You set up a new thing, but you never close the old thing. So you just end up with more going out of the door because there's unrationed demand. So it's really hard when you turn it into a money conversation to make it work, even though in principle it should. I don't have an answer either. I'm just admired the problem in a different way. It is hard. Which is why I come back to, is there another way than getting the state to do it? Because it's just too hard and work. Although they can borrow money cheaply, they don't spend it well. And actually, we all spend our own budgets well. We've all got time on our hands. Well, I do. Maybe there's a contribution you can tap into, which is easier to get than convincing the Treasury. I don't know if that's helpful.
Definitely. Very interesting. I hope it's okay, but I'm thinking that it might be a good moment to shift onto housing. And we've got a couple of people on who are who has some particular expertise in housing, particularly Ian Graham for one. But I'm going to start with Susie, and then I'm going to hand over to Ian, because Susie, you wanted to raise a report related to housing, and then we'll maybe go to Ian to talk as well. Susie.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, well, I was just going to highlight the Coming Home report, which is a very excellent one from the Archbishop's Housing Commission, and we were lucky to have one of the co-commissioners, the Right Reverend Dr. Graham Tomlin, talk to a bit about it at the Big Tent event. The church made some really strong and really great commitments in there, particularly obviously around the housing. And I just want to say that the big part of it is about communities, building communities, and I guess I think my question is where will when particularly talking about more vulnerable families and children, how what role does the church see itself, particularly in that housing area?
Before Ian comes in, can I say thank you for promoting the Coming Home. It is a brilliant report. One of the really interesting things that in response has been that the what people have valued most is not just the practical suggestions, but the five values that are promoted in Coming Home, on which housing should be shaped. They are, I always have to get them out, but sustainability, safety, and then stability, sociability, and satisfaction. And Graham might have shared this when he did the Big Tent. They came up with those five values. They then added a sixth through discussion which occurred, and that was sacrifice. That's the one that they were quite concerned that wider society might not like, thought it sounded terribly religious and everything. But I'll tell you that Barrett's Builders, at least, are one of them, and two of our local social housing providers have already said that's the most significant one, and we agree with you. If we're going to get decent housing, it does involve sacrifice as well as the other five values. So thank you for mentioning it, Susie. If you hadn't, I was going to, but.
Excellent, good. And Ian, you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, just a quick one, John. Paul, I'm interested, if you're speaking to ministers, that one of the frustrations that I've always felt, spent a lot of time working with social housing providers, is the lack of joined up thinking between housing, health, education. Standing back from it, it all seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? But when you actually get into the funding equation for affordable housing, government tends to chase numbers of homes. Now, I think the pandemic hopefully has made everyone focus much more, as you said in your introduction, about space, outside space, but also inside space. Space for children to work, to have recreational space. We really do need the government to accept that, and not just accept that in principle, but translate that into the way capital funding is applied to social housing. Because if it's still applied in the way it was, you won't get all of that, because it just isn't affordable. The subsidies being given to social housing providers, such as those you mentioned, who would, I'm sure, absolutely want to do that, just as the business I chair wants to do it. There is a question of whether the capital subsidy is sufficient to enable them to do it. So we do need government to think across the piece.
Yeah, I agree. Can I? So I simply agree with that. In terms of follow-on, because I'm conscious of time, but so a piece of work that I've just become involved with, as a follow-on to the Housing Commission, the Archbishops have created a commission on family and household, which I'm co-chairing with Professor Janet Walker, who used to be up here in Newcastle. We don't anticipate reporting until November 22, but that is so it's looking at what makes for good family in life and households. So recognizing a third of households in our country are single person households. So that's trying to build on the Housing Commission and explore those questions. So I share that so that anyone on the call, if you'd like to know more information about that, it's been launched. But we're still finalising our 12 commissioners. But our first meeting is at the end of May, and we will be looking for people to contribute into it from every walk of life. So that's the next follow-on, Susie.
Great. Yeah. Okay. So we've got about 8 minutes left of the formal bit of the evening. And we've covered quite a lot of the questions in the chat so far. Wendy, you raise a question. What about the sacrifice of second homeowners and the effect they have on local housing? Of course, that's quite a hot potato, but why not raise it?
I think the problem is that if you have the money to want somewhere which is nice and you can get away with the family and all the rest of it, is a great pull. However, it means, and we've got experience of this in Norfolk, as I'm sure you have in lots of other beautiful places, but it means that the house prices get pushed up, and people who work locally, and I understand from somebody who said this to me, so don't quote me because it might be wrong, that the average salary in Norfolk is about 14,000. Now, if you're looking to rent a house or buy a house, preferably, because most people want to buy, if you have people coming in from, sorry, I was going to be very rude then, I was going to say Cheyne Walk, but London, places like that, and buying up places in Norfolk, St Ives, Pembrokeshire, local people can't afford them. I know it sounds as if it's wanting to bash people because they can afford something, but I think that somehow people who can afford that should be able to put more into the pot for the people who can't afford it and who are actually paying the price for the second homeowners. Sorry, that sounds a bit.
It's an interesting point, and I suspect Mark's got an opinion on that. And I can see you've unmuted yourself, Mark, so therefore you're vulnerable.
well, yeah, I do. I've written about it. You can read my opinion on it. I've written something called Reimagine Property Taxes, which basically identifies that when you make your principal residence a one-way tax-free investment, which unless you are fortunate enough to have assets worth more than £1 million when you expire, and most people who do can plan that away, it's an untaxed one-way bet. Any other investment option for you is worse in terms of the tax position. And so it encourages not only second homes, but I mean, you don't have to, I mean, that's a polarizing example, but take your primary home. People over-occupy property because downsizing releases cash that if you put it in something else, gets taxed if it grows, right? If you sell your £1 million house by a £500,000 house, put your £500,000 away, and it grows by 10%, you give some of that to the chancellor. You should leave it in your 1 million house and you know, it's tax-free. And actually, if you were to charge capital gains tax on primary residence, defer it till death, so you don't actually take money out of people's pockets while they're in the housing market, the whole country makes money when house prices go up. You build a train line somewhere, and everybody's property price goes up. A third of that goes back to the chancellor, who can borrow against it and build the train line. I mean, it's just I've written about it. I think there's merit in it. No Tory government's ever going to do it. I've pitched it to enough of them. I've pitched it to every housing minister. It's a long list because they only last a year. I've also pitched better solutions for renters, employer-backed build to rent, where employers can basically work with that money that's cheap from Canadian pension funds to create properties where if you give a guarantee that you'll keep them full for 25 years, you can offer a 30% rent discount higher if you're a public sector employer because your covenant's better. You know, you can offer nurses a 40% rent discount. It's all there, but government isn't interested in making it easier to rent because they know if you own your home, you're more likely to vote blue. And so what they're investing in is demand side subsidy. Again, you know, you cut stamp duty, you give people 5,000 back in their deposit. It just means they can borrow 50 more. It doesn't take long before that flows to the main beneficiary of the stamp duty cut, which is people who own property and are selling it to first-time buyers. You cut stamp duty, you enrich the old, not the young. The government's housing policy is upside down, and if anybody wants to help me try and persuade them they're wrong, join me. But I've tried.
I mean, there are just so many problems with housing. It's interesting. I'm looking to move flat at the moment. I'm renting in West London, but it is interesting to see that outside space is something which now comes at a premium, and which it didn't before. I was interested to see, definitely interested to see that. So good. Okay. Maggie Haggis, you raised a question which is slightly moving away from the topic about aging without children, an increasing part of Britain's demographic. Did you want to come in?
Hello, I have a bit of a problem with my voice. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Very well.
Okay, fine. Yes, I'm part of this aging without children demographic, and I live in a 5-6 bedroom terraced house that I can no longer afford to run. So since way before I got old, I'm 72 now, I've been interested in looking at intergenerational housing cooperatives as a way of enabling myself to stay in place, but freeing up the upper part of the house for young people who don't have the bank of mum and dad to take control of their housing. But although I've been talking to lots of different people over the years, including the co-op here in Manchester and in Wales, there doesn't seem to be, nobody seems to be looking at this. If you're my kind of age and you have some disposable income and you want to stay in place, then of course you can make your place into a couple of flats. But if you don't have that disposable income, what started me off on this was 20 years ago, I was the person keeping an eye on two of my neighbours who were the age I am now, who were each occupying 2 rooms of a 6-bedroom terraced house, because that's all they could afford to heat, and they struggled with the stairs. And I'm in a not quite the same situation, but for most of us older people, if they've got disposable income, they're perhaps looking at co-housing. But if you've not got anybody to leave your property to me it makes sense that you put it into some kind of a housing cooperative, perhaps with shared equity, which would then benefit some of the next generation coming along, as it were. But it's finding a way of doing that. But the actual question that I wrote there, because we were talking about the fact that older people are not mixing with children so much, but you do have, apparently, it's very shortly, it'll be 40% of the older generation are living alone, many of whom will not have children. So we need to be looking at how you lot can get us all involved a bit more.
Interesting.
It's true. I think you're right, Maggie. I think you're onto something about it's a matter of finding ways in which other people might be able to help be willing to invest in a house like yours to turn it into that multiple occupancy so that there is some kind of.
But the thing is, you don't want the multiple occupancy. The thing with housing cooperatives, they got an exemption. If you're an HMO, which is pretty much what you're suggesting there, a housing cooperative, you don't have to ruin the property in order to accommodate more than 3 people staying in a property that's over 2 stories. But what I was interested in was how we have shared ownership and equity purchases to enable the original owner occupier to remain in place. And obviously with property prices so high, then the housing cooperative may not be able to afford to buy the whole property, but it should be possible for the original owner occupier to retain some equity. And then when they either pop their clogs or need to go into care, the housing cooperative could be in a position to purchase the remainder of the equity. It's just trying to look at different ways of doing things, as we all are.
Fascinating. I think we've had a truly great debate this evening and great discussion. It's 9:18, and so probably the time has come to wrap up the sort of the formal Q&A part. You're all welcome to stay on and have an informal chat, but it remains for me to say thank you so much for coming, everybody. It's a fascinating debate, and there were so many facets of this. The Big Tent is focusing on regeneration and levelling up. We're off to the Coventry City of Culture this year to hopefully open and potentially also close it in early next year. So do watch out for information on that. And thank you very much for coming along. And Paul, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah. Thank you for your time this evening. So thank you.